The valley of Hearthmore had always looked peaceful from a distant rows of terraced fields, cobbled lanes curling like ribbons between stone cottages, and the towering silhouettes of frost-bitten mountains rising like ancient guardians around the town. But beauty, as Alara had learned, was often a mask. Underneath the picturesque stillness lay a system built on fear, superstition, and rigid traditions that suffocated anyone who dared step out of line. And in this place, the worst accusation a woman could face was infertility. To the council, fertility was everything. It was tied to worth, morality, and loyalty. The valley had once suffered a famine and plague generations ago, and in surviving it, the townsfolk clung to the belief that the continuation of the bloodline was their divine mandate. To disobey that mandate was considered treason. To fail it was considered corruption. The council kept that fear alive, whispering that barren women would bring back the curse that once starved the town to the bone. It had become an easy weapon, one they used when a woman stepped too far out of the role expected of her. Alara had never expected the weapon to be turned on her. She was a healer, one of the best in the entire valley, known for steady hands and sharp intuition. She had helped mothers through childbirth, nursed the sick through harsh winters, and brewed medicines from mountain herbs that no one else could identify. For years, people sought her out in secret and in daylight alike. Yet it wasn't enough to protect her from the council's gaze. Her troubles began the day she refused Councillor Bram's proposal on behalf of his son. He had approached her with a tone of false generosity, as though offering her a privilege she should be grateful for. But Alara saw in the son the same cruelty that lived in the rest of Bram's bloodline. Entitlement wrapped in charm, authority disguised as benevolence. She had declined without hesitation. The counselor had smiled then, a thin, controlled smile that never reached his eyes, and simply said, "No woman refuses the will of the council." Days later, rumors began. Whispers in the marketplace. Mothers hurrying their children past her cottage. Men avoiding her gaze. Then the council summoned her to the Hall of Purity, a place where verdicts were issued without evidence and justice was decided before the accused ever arrived. They declared her infertile on the spot. No examination, no process. Just a proclamation. The sentence, humiliation and public cleansing, meant to purge the blight and warn others who might stray. And so, on the cold morning that marked the beginning of her nightmare, Alara found herself standing at the center of the town square, wrists bound by a thick ceremonial rope dyed with red clay. The counselors stood in a line, like vultures cloaked in crisp black coats, their eyes sharp and hungry. Behind them, townspeople gathered in a hesitant crowd, not daring to intervene, not daring to look away. Alara tried to lift her chin, tried to hold on to her dignity even as the frost bit into her skin. She wasn't afraid of their lies. They could call her barren, wicked, cursed, whatever words they thought would break her spirit. But she feared what the ritual would become. The dragging was only the beginning. There were darker punishments waiting at the edge of the valley, punishments that had claimed countless women before her. Still, in those first moments, what hurt her most wasn't the rope tightening around her wrists. It was the silence, the way people she had healed, helped, comforted, now looked at her with lowered eyes. As the rope handler stepped forward and the counselor raised his hand to begin the ritual, Alara closed her eyes. And in that brief moment of stillness, she prayed for something, anything, that might break the cycle of cruelty Hearthmore had lived under for generations. She had no idea that her prayer would be answered, nor that someone had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment he could intervene. The rope was more than a tool, it was a symbol. Every knot, every twist in its length had been crafted specifically for this purpose, to shame, to bind, to display. Red clay and ash had been rubbed into its fibers until the rope looked like a streak of dried blood. It was meant to send a message. This person is unclean. This person is marked. Ilara felt its roughness bite into her wrists as the ritual began. The handlers, two broad-shouldered men chosen by the council for their obedient loyalty, tugged sharply, forcing her to stumble forward. The crowd parted not out of respect, but out of fear, as if touching her would somehow let the council's condemnation rub off on them. Children who once ran to her for soothing salves now hid behind their mothers' skirts. Some of the mothers watched with trembling lips, torn between instinctive compassion and the terror of being seen sympathizing. A single glance of empathy could be twisted into defiance, and defiance was dangerous here. The council's bell tolled overhead, its low metallic hum echoing across the square. Each toll marked another step of her forced march. She could feel the eyes on her, curious, guilty, hungry for spectacle. But beneath those layers, she sensed something else. Fatigue. The town was tired. Tired of the council's growing list of offenses, tired of pretending fear was devotion, tired of watching cruelty paraded as righteousness. Still, no one dared move. Councillor Bram walked behind the procession like a man savoring a feast, hands clasped behind him as if this were a ceremony of honor rather than humiliation. "Let the valley see what comes of disobedience," he declared, loudly enough for every window and alleyway to hear. Infertility is a sickness of the spirit. Today, we cleanse the impurity. Ilara gritted her teeth. She knew the ritual well. She had tended to women who survived earlier accusations, patched their wounds as they whispered stories of pain and exile. But this was her first time on the receiving end. Each pull of the rope dragged her across uneven cobblestones, scraping her knees and palms as she struggled to stay upright. Dust rose around her, mixing with the metallic scent of blood beginning to trickle down her shins. The handlers moved faster, eager to complete their task before doubt or mercy could interfere. One yanked the rope high, forcing her to stumble again. Laughter rose from a small cluster of younger men who idolized the council. They whispered loudly among themselves, calling her names meant to cut deeper than the rope ever could. But others in the crowd flinched at the cruelty. A baker wiped her tear-streaked cheek with a flour-covered hand. A shepherd shook his head and turned away, unable to watch. An elderly man muttered a prayer under his breath, though whether it was for Ilara or for the soul of the town, she couldn't tell. She felt the rope tighten again, sharper this time. Her breath hitched. The handlers were nearing the second stage of the ritual, the slow drag around the perimeter of the square, the part meant to break a person's will. Even through her pain, Ilara's mind raced. This wasn't truly about fertility. The council's accusations had grown more frequent in the past year, targeting anyone who dared to question their authority. To them, infertile didn't mean incapable of bearing children, it meant incapable of being controlled. The word had become a weapon polished by fear. Her legs shook, but she refused to collapse. If she fell, they would drag her. If she resisted, they would beat her. If she surrendered, the council would win. Every step she took upright was an act of rebellion, one the counselor clearly noticed. He narrowed his eyes, lips tightening. He wanted her broken, not defiant. "Lower her head," he ordered. The handlers moved to obey, but something shifted in the air. A hush swept the crowd. Heads turned toward the edge of the square, where the shadows pooled between two buildings. There, a tall shape stood motionless, watching with a stillness that felt unnatural. No one recognized him. No one spoke his name, but Ilara felt his gaze settle on her like a promise. And though she didn't know why, her breath eased. Something was about to change. The rope tugged again, snapping Ilara's attention back to the agony digging into her wrists. She stumbled, nearly falling onto the stone steps of the marketplace fountain. The handlers jerked the rope upward to steady her, not out of kindness, but to keep the ritual intact. A fall would disrupt the choreography, and the council valued spectacle over everything. As she regained her footing, the words that had started this entire nightmare echoed in her mind. No woman refuses the will of the council. That was the real crime, not infertility, not impurity, disobedience. Elara had lived her entire life on the margins of town expectations. As a healer, she held a level of respect few others enjoyed, but it came with invisible chains. People wanted her knowledge, her herbs, her steady hands, but they also expected her compliance. A healer was supposed to be grateful, humble, obedient, someone who existed to serve the community without question. And she had served, year after year, even as the council's rules tightened like a noose. They had begun small limits on who could marry whom, permissions required for travel beyond the valley, mandatory purity checks conducted by council-appointed midwives. Then came the quotas. Families were expected to produce a minimum number of children to secure the valley's future. Those who fell short were watched closely, judged silently. But things took a darker turn the day a woman named Sira collapsed on Elara's cottage doorstep with bruises covering her ribs. She had been one child short of her assigned quota, and the council's enforcers had encouraged her to try harder. Elara had treated her injuries in secret, giving her a place to hide until her husband returned from the mountains. The council learned of it, and from that moment, Elara was marked, not formally, not publicly, but in whispers. They watched her more closely. They asked probing questions. They requested reports on every person she treated, which she refused to give. They made her walk a thin line. Then came the proposal. Councillor Bram's son Lorian was notorious for his temper. He was used to getting what he wanted and punishing whatever he didn't. Marrying into the council's most powerful lineage would have elevated Elara's status, but at the cost of her freedom. She had refused him calmly, without insult, without challenge. Yet the rejection humiliated him. And in Hearthmoor, a wounded ego, especially the ego of a man close to power, was a dangerous thing. Elara hadn't expected the retribution to be swift, or this cruel. The handlers dragged her past the bakery, the herbal merchant's stall, and the smithy where she had once treated burns on the apprentice's hands. Every corner of the square held memories, some painful, most kind. But today those memories felt like fading stars, swallowed by the darkness spreading from the council's authority. Infertile. The word echoed again as the crowd murmured. She wanted to scream the truth, that she was perfectly healthy, that the accusation was a lie, but she knew it wouldn't matter. The council didn't need proof. In Hearthmoor, truth bent to their will like iron in a forge. Her knees buckled again as the rope jerked her around another corner. This time she couldn't catch herself. She crashed onto the rough stones, pain flaring sharply through her palms and hips. A gasp rose from the crowd. One of the handlers reached to yank her upright, but Councillor Bram raised a hand. "No," he said with a smile that made her stomach twist. "Let her crawl. Let them see what defiance becomes." The handler hesitated. Even he looked uncertain about the cruelty of the order, but orders were orders. He loosened his hold on the rope, leaving Elara half kneeling, half sprawled on the stones. Blood trickled down her legs. Dust clung to her hair. The world blurred with pain and humiliation. But even as her vision wavered, the memory of a different kind of cruelty filled her mind, the cruelty she had witnessed hidden behind closed doors, in whispered confessions, in bruised skin and trembling hands. "This is not about me," she thought. "This is the council's way, their weapon, their control." For a moment, her fear hardened into something sharper. Not rage, not vengeance, resolve. If she survived this, she would expose them. She would break them. But before she could gather her strength, another ripple passed through the crowd, the same shift she had felt earlier, subtle but unmistakable. Heads turned, murmurs grew. The watchers stared toward the edge of the square where the shadowed figure remained still, silent, but unmistakably focused on her. She didn't know his name. She had never seen him before. But instinct told her one thing with startling clarity. Whoever he was, he had not come to watch her fall. The figure in the shadows didn't move at first. He simply stood there, tall and broad, like a tree that had grown from the mountains themselves. A fur-lined hood cast most of his face in darkness, but even from across the square, Elara sensed something different about him, something that didn't belong to Hearthmoor's suffocating order. The townsfolk noticed too. A woman near the fountain whispered to her neighbor, "Is that?" No, he wouldn't dare come down. Another man shook his head quickly, muttering, "Mountain folk don't mix with us. They stay in the high passes. They don't interfere." Then who was he? Elara's breath was shallow, her body trembling from exhaustion, yet her mind sharpened as she watched the stranger. He wasn't like the counselors or their enforcers' men who puffed up their chests to appear strong. No, this stranger didn't posture. His stillness carried an ease born of real capability, as if he didn't have to prove his strength. It spoke for him. Counselor Bram finally noticed the stir in the crowd. His eyes narrowed. "Who is that?" he demanded, his irritation prickling like static. He hated disruptions. Rituals were meant to be controlled, predictable, choreographed, just like the town under his rule. One of the enforcers stepped forward, squinting toward the edge of the square. Some hunter, perhaps? "A traveler," Bram snorted. No traveler enters Hearthmoor without permission. The stranger chose that moment to take a single step forward. It was small, barely more than a shift of weight, but the movement rippled through the crowd like a gust of wind. People instinctively stepped back, creating a widening path without even being asked. Elara's heartbeat picked up. Something inside her stirred a mix of hope and fear. Who was he? And why did he radiate the quiet certainty of someone who feared neither counsel nor consequence? She didn't know, but the handlers must have sensed the growing tension. One gave a sharp jerk of the rope, reminding her that she was still bound, still on her knees, still subjected to the cruelty of the ritual. Pain lanced up her arms as she stumbled forward. A few people turned away, unable or unwilling to watch. "Continue," Bram ordered. His voice was high-pitched now, thin with unease. "The ritual will not be interrupted." But the handlers hesitated. Their eyes flicked between the counselor and the approaching stranger. Something about the man's presence gnawed at their instincts. Obeying Bram usually brought reward. Defying him brought punishment. But crossing the stranger, their bodies told them that might bring something far worse. The stranger stepped fully into the light now. He towered over most of the men, his dark hair tied back, jaw dusted with a few days of stubble, shoulders wrapped in a thick cloak lined with wolf fur. He looked as if he de-stepped out of one of the old legends, the kind whispered around winter fires about the mountain watchers, solitary men who lived in the peaks, protecting the valley from threats long forgotten. His eyes, sharp, unyielding, fell on Elara, and in that moment she understood one thing clearly. This man was not here by accident. He took another step. Then another. Counselor Bram raised a hand, trying to regain control. "Stop right there," he barked. The stranger didn't even slow. "You are interfering with a sanctioned ritual," Bram continued, his voice faltering. "This woman is being purified." A deep voice cut through the air. "No," the stranger said, each syllable solid as stone. "This woman is being punished for refusing you." A gasp swept through the crowd. Another wave of whispers. Someone dropped a basket of apples, which rolled across the stones like startled birds. Elara froze. He knew. Bram's face flushed crimson anger, fear, humiliation mixing in ugly colors. "Who are you to speak of our laws?" The stranger stopped only when he reached Elara's side. He towered over the handlers now, who instinctively stepped back. Without a word, he knelt beside her, and his hand brushed the rope binding her wrists. His touch was gentle, but his presence was a shield. He looked up at Bram, eyes dark with a warning. "Someone who does not tolerate lies," he said. Alara didn't know his name, but in that moment, bleeding, bruised, humiliated, she felt something she hadn't felt since the ordeal began. Safety, and with it, the first spark of defiance burning anew in her chest. The square had fallen into a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself thickened. Even the wind, usually a constant whisper in Hearthmore, seemed to hold its breath as the stranger knelt beside Alara. His presence was a disruption to everything the council relied on: obedience, intimidation, predictability. He was none of those things. He radiated a quiet defiance, the kind that didn't need shouting or threats. Alara could feel the heat of him beside her, the sullenness of someone who lived with danger as a daily companion. Up close she noticed details she hadn't before: scars darting across his knuckles like pale lightning, a faint scent of pine and cold air lingering on his cloak, the steadiness of his breathing even under the hostile stares of an entire town. The handlers were caught between orders and instinct. One opened his mouth as if to protest, but the stranger's gaze flicked toward him, just a glance. Nothing more, and the man's courage withered immediately. Alara swallowed hard, her throat raw. She wanted to speak, to ask him who he was and why he was doing this, but her voice trembled too much to risk the attempt. Counselor Bram finally regained some semblance of control. His lips curled in a sneer he clearly intended as intimidating. "Unbind her," he said mockingly. "Go on, and then what? You will take her with you? You will challenge the Council of Hearthmore on behalf of a barren liar?" The stranger rose to his full height. "I will challenge a council that punishes people for defying its greed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This time it wasn't just fear, it was recognition. People had thought these things for years, whispered them behind closed doors, swallowed them like bitter medicine. But no one had ever said them aloud. Not like this, not publicly. Bram sputtered. "Greed? You dare. I dare," the stranger said, voice low. "Because lies don't frighten me." He turned to Alara then, and his expression softened, not quite gentleness, but a fierce, protective concern. "Can you stand?" Her legs shook as she tried. Pain shot through her knees, but she nodded. The stranger slipped a strong arm beneath hers to steady her. His touch was careful, almost hesitant, as if he were adjusting his strength to avoid hurting her. Her breath hitched. In this place where cruelty was normal, gentleness felt foreign enough to be jarring. Bram's voice rose again, desperate now. "She is property of the council until the ritual is finished." The stranger's jaw clenched. With one swift, fluid motion, he drew a knife from his belt, its blade curved, sharpened from use rather than display. Before anyone could react, he slashed downward. The rope fell in two pieces, frayed ends fluttering like defeated banners. Gasps erupted from every corner of the square. Even Alara recoiled slightly, not from fear, but from the shock of sudden freedom. Her wrists throbbed as blood flow returned, but she barely felt it. She was unbound. Counselor Bram lurched forward. "Seize him! Seize both of them!" he shouted, voice cracking. But the enforcers hesitated. The crowd was watching them, eyes gleaming with something dangerous: curiosity, frustration, longing for change. For the first time, the council's authority didn't feel absolute. The stranger stepped between Alara and the approaching guards, shoulders squared. "If you touch her," he said quietly, "you will not leave the square standing." The threat wasn't shouted or embellished. It didn't need to be. The sheer certainty in his tone sent a shiver through everyone who heard it. Alara's heart pounded. She knew this moment, this razor's edge, could tip into violence or collapse entirely. But she also sensed something shifting in the crowd. People stood taller. Some nodded subtly. Others stepped away from the counselors, creating distance and doubt. Bram looked around and saw it too. Panic flared in his eyes. He had expected compliance, not hesitation. The stranger leaned closer to Ilara. "I'm getting you out of here," he murmured. She met his gaze, breath trembling. "Why?" His expression softened again, barely noticeable but unmistakable. "Because what they're doing to you is wrong," he said. "And I don't stand aside when innocent people bleed." Her throat tightened. No one in Hearthmore spoke like that. No one acted like that. Around them, the crowd's silence stretched thinner and thinner, ready to tear. The rope lay severed on the stones, a symbol undone. And the balance of power in Hearthmore shifted by a single, irrevocable act of defiance. For a long, fragile heartbeat, nothing happened. The square held its breath as if the entire valley were suspended on the edge of a knife. Ilara could feel her pulse in places she didn't know a pulse could throb: her wrists, her temples, the raw places on her knees. The stranger's warmth beside her was the only anchor she had in a world threatening to spin out of control. Then the second heartbeat came, and with it, the shouting. "Move!" Counselor Bram screamed, spittle flying. "Do your duty. Seize them, that is an order." But the enforcers, the same men who had dragged Ilara across the stones, looked uncertain. Their expressions wavered between loyalty and survival instinct. One stepped forward half a pace before stopping abruptly as the stranger fixed his gaze on him. A warning, a promise. A line he would not let them cross. The enforcer swallowed hard and stepped back. The crowd whispered again, louder this time. The shift had begun earlier, but now it grew like a spark catching dry grass. People exchanged glances, fear mixed with something braver, something they weren't used to feeling. Hope. Ilara tried to stand fully, leaning slightly into the stranger's steadying arm. Each movement sent pain shooting up her legs, but she forced herself upright. She wouldn't let Bram see weakness. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Her voice, raw and strained, finally found its way out. "You accused me without proof." Bram's head snapped toward her, fury twisting his features. "Your proof is your defiance. A disobedient woman brings rot to the valley. You invited this punishment." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She saw several townsfolk flinch, women who knew those words too well, men who'd watched their wives and daughters suffer under the same rules. The stranger turned slightly to face Bram. "Your laws serve only yourselves," he said. "Your power is built on fear. You twist tradition into chains." Bram pointed at him, shaking with rage. "You are an outsider, a savage from the mountains. This is not your valley. These are not your people. You have no right." "I have every right," the stranger interrupted, his voice steady as stone. "Because injustice anywhere in these mountains belongs to all of us." Gasps broke through the crowd. No one had challenged the council openly in decades, not since long before Ilara was born. A few of Bram's advisors huddled close, whispering anxiously. They could feel the town slipping through their grip. "Enough!" Bram barked, desperate now. "If my enforcers will not act, then I will." He grabbed a ceremonial staff from the nearest advisor, a thick wooden rod carved with symbols of authority. Lifting it high, he stormed toward them, madness flickering in his eyes. The stranger stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between Bram and Ilara. "Stay behind me," he murmured. But Bram never reached them. A sudden cry came from the crowd, a woman's voice, sharp and trembling. "Stop this, counselor!" All eyes turned. It was Mara, the baker whose children Ilara had once saved during a winter fever. She stepped forward, hands clenched at her sides. "This is wrong. She has done nothing but help us." "You know she has," another voice joined, then another. A young shepherd stepped forward. Then an elderly man who had been silent all morning. One by one, the townspeople began shifting, not all, not even most, but enough. They moved subtly, forming a loose semicircle around Ilara and the stranger, not touching, not openly defying, but blocking Bram's path in quiet solidarity. Bram's eyes widened. "You ungrateful fools," he hissed. "You would betray tradition for her?" "No," the elderly man said softly. "We betray nothing. We remember who we are." For the first time, Bram looked genuinely afraid. His support was thinning. His ritual was unraveling. The power he wielded like a weapon was slipping through his hands like water. The stranger leaned down to Alara, voice low. "This is our moment. Can you walk?" She nodded, despite the pain. "Yes." "Then we move now," he said. He slipped his arm around her again, not possessive, not forceful, but protective. "I'll get you out." As they began to take their first steps away from the square, the rope lay on the stones behind them like a shed skin. The council had meant it as a symbol of submission, but today it became a symbol of the first crack in their rule. And cracks had a way of turning into breaks. The moment Alara and the stranger began to move, the entire square seemed to shift with them. It wasn't a dramatic uproar, not a sudden revolt, just a subtle but undeniable reorientation, as though the invisible balance of power had quietly tilted. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the cobblestones, lifting strands of Alara's hair as she leaned into the stranger for support. Every step stabbed at her knees, yet each one felt like reclaiming a piece of herself the council had tried to tear away. The stranger adjusted his pace to match hers, slow and steady, his arm still firm around her. Behind them, Bram's outraged shrieking filled the square like the screech of a cornered animal. "Stop them! Stop them, I say! They are fleeing judgment. This is treason. Do you hear me? Treason?" But the word held less weight now. The crowd no longer echoed it. Some moved aside to let Alara pass. Others looked down, ashamed of their earlier silence. A few, very few, moved a little closer, as if their bodies were finally catching up to their hearts. When Alara reached the edge of the square, she felt her breath hitch. This was the line she had crossed countless times in her daily life, walking between her cottage and the marketplace. Yet today, stepping over it felt like stepping into an entirely new world, a world where she was no longer under the council as thumb. But they weren't safe yet, and the stranger clearly knew it. His eyes kept sweeping the edges of the crowd, sharp and alert, calculating escape routes the way a seasoned hunter might track prey. Alara forced her voice out. "The gates," she said quietly. "They'll bar them if they think we're leaving the valley." The stranger nodded. "We're not going to the gates," she blinked. "Then where?" He tilted his head slightly toward the narrow alleys branching between the houses. "There are two paths out of Hearthmoor that the council doesn't control. One through the grain tunnels beneath the granary. One through the old storm drainage channels. Both are unguarded. You know the town," she whispered, surprised. He gave a subtle, almost reluctant nod. "I've watched it long enough to understand its traps." Before she could ask more, a commotion erupted behind them. Bram had finally convinced a handful of enforcers to act either through threats or promises. They pushed through the edges of the crowd, weapons drawn. "There!" one shouted. "Stop them!" The stranger cursed it under his breath. "Move," he told Alara, guiding her down a narrow street toward the granary. But her legs were shaking more violently now, the adrenaline beginning to fade. Pain throbbed through her knees and hips, each step harder than the last. She stumbled. The stranger caught her instantly, steadying her. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you." His voice was deep, calming, unexpectedly gentle for someone who looked like he could take on a bear with his bare hands. "I can keep going," she insisted, though it was half a lie. "I know," he said quietly. "But you don't have to alone." They reached the granary, an old stone building with thick walls and a heavy cedar door. The smell of grain and dust hung in the air. The stranger moved quickly, pushing the door open and guiding her inside. Behind them, footsteps pounded. Voices barked orders. "Hurry," the stranger said, his tone still calm but edged now with urgency. He crossed the room to a large wooden trapdoor hidden beneath stacked sacks of barley. With a single heave, he lifted it, revealing a dark stairway descending into the granary tunnels. Ilara hesitated at the top of the steps, staring into the darkness. "How did you even know this was here?" He met her gaze. His eyes were strikingly clear, steady, unwavering. "Your valley is not as closed as your council believes. There are paths known only to those who live above it." She swallowed. "You're one of the mountain tribes?" "Was," he corrected gently. "Long ago." Before she could ask more, the door behind them shuddered. Enforcers had reached the granary. The stranger extended a hand. "Ilara, we don't have time." Her heart pounded. Her mind raced. Everything she knew, everything familiar, was behind her. Everything unknown, everything dangerous, everything free was below. She grabbed his hand, and together they descended into the darkness just as the granary door burst open above them. The moment Raran placed himself between Ilara and the council's enforcers, the square seemed to tilt as if the very stones were bracing for a confrontation. The counselor Edric Thorne, a man who had built his power on intimidation and ritualized shame, stared at Raran with a mixture of disbelief and brewing fury. No outsider had ever interfered with a council decree, let alone in front of the entire town. Raran didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, chest rising and falling with quiet steadiness, as though unaffected by the dozen armed guards tightening formation around him. Ilara could feel the tension radiating from his body, not the fear of a man who expected to die, but the alertness of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact kind of moment. Edric Thorne finally broke the silence. "Mountain Man," he sneered, using the title as an insult. "You step into a matter that does not concern you." Raran's reply was calm, almost too calm. "It concerns every living soul who still remembers what justice means." A ripple went through the crowd. Anyone else who had said those words would have been seized immediately. But the guards hesitated. Raran's reputation reached far beyond the mountain ridges. Some said he had once been a town soldier before disappearing into the wilderness. Others whispered that he'd survived a bear attack and killed the beast with his bare hands. Stories exaggerated, as they always did, but his presence alone made men think twice. Edric, however, was not accustomed to being challenged. His face reddened. "The woman is infertile," he barked. "A danger to the prosperity of our people. Our laws are clear." Raran's eyes flicked to Ilara, then back to the counselor. "She is not infertile," he said, each word precise. "You know that." Edric's brows twitched, subtle but noticeable. Raran continued, raising his voice so the crowd could hear him. "You use that accusation to silence any woman who refuses obedience. You call them barren so you can drag them through streets and make them examples. You want fear, not families." A gasp swept the square. Even those who suspected the truth rarely dared to speak it aloud. Ilara felt as if Raran had sliced open the very heart of the valley's corruption. For years, the council had used infertility as a catch-all charge impossible to disprove, convenient for punishing those who questioned authority. Some victims had vanished into exile. Others were forced into labor camps beyond the river. She herself had always known the risks of refusing Edric Thorne's son, but she hadn't expected the council to act so swiftly, so publicly. Edric tried to laugh, but it cracked under the weight of Raran's words. "You have no proof," he said. "And even if you did, you have no authority here." "I have the truth," Raran replied. "And that is authority enough." The guards shifted uncertainly. Some avoided Raran's gaze. Others glanced toward the townspeople, whose faces had turned from passive curiosity to uneasy contemplation. A few of the women looked stricken, as if remembering old accusations leveled at their sisters, cousins, friends. Ilara saw something else too, hope. Fragile, rising, trembling, but there. Edric's calm broke. "Seize him," he roared. But only 2 guards stepped forward quickly. The others hesitated, suddenly unsure whether they were following a lawful order or participating in something far darker. Roran squared his stance, ready, his hand tightening around the axe handle. Before the guards could reach him, Roran added one final blow knot with his weapon. But with his voice, Alara's healer records were altered. "I saw them. I saw the original copies before your son burned them." The square erupted, and the council's walls of lies began, at last, to crack. The murmurs in the square had grown louder, weaving into a chorus of disbelief and whispered truths. People who had once nodded obediently to the council now exchanged glances charged with a mix of fear and recognition. Each person seemed to remember their own quiet injustices, the punishments that had been disguised as law, the neighbors, friends, and daughters who had suffered silently. Alara felt her chest tighten as the realization hit her. The council had relied entirely on silence. Control had never needed proof. It only needed complicity. And now, for the first time, the complicity wavered. A middle-aged woman from the crowd stepped forward. Her voice trembled but carried. "It is true," she said, glancing around to see if anyone would challenge her. "My daughter was called infertile last year. She was not. You took her from her home for weeks as punishment." Another voice rang out, this time a man, a shepherd whose hands were rough from years of labor. "And my wife healed the sick and was accused the same." His face was flushed, anger breaking through decades of fear. "I will not stand by while you punish those who serve the valley." The crowd shifted. Others joined, timid at first, then bolder. Each declaration chipped away at the council's image of omnipotence. The words had been whispered for years, but hearing them shouted, seeing witnesses step forward, was like opening a dam. Ilara's fear mingled with something new, astonishment. This had never happened before. People had followed orders without question, because questioning meant pain or exile or worse. Now the very townspeople who had watched her dragged through the square were speaking, standing up, daring to contradict the council openly. Edric Thorne's face darkened with fury. He attempted to shout over the growing clamor, but his voice faltered as he realized the crowd no longer obeyed blindly. The whispers became a roar, and the councilor's authority, once unquestioned, cracked under the weight of collective defiance. Roran's gaze swept the square, sharp and calculating. He moved closer to Ilara, subtly shielding her from the nearest enforcer. "Keep close," he said quietly. "They will attempt to regroup, but the tide has turned. Use the crowd. Move swiftly." Ilara nodded, heart pounding. The crowd was her shield now, a living wall of resistance. She recognized faces she had helped over the years. A mother whose child she had delivered safely in the dead of night, a baker she had tended when he cut his hand on a broken blade, a schoolteacher whose fever she had cured with herbs. All of them now formed an unseen barrier against the council's power. One of the council's younger enforcers took a hesitant step forward, but a shout from the crowd made him freeze. "We see your lies," a voice bellowed. Another joined, louder, "You punish the innocent." Edric Thorne spun, panic rising as he realized he was losing control. "Seize them! The mountain man and the witch take them." But the enforcers faltered, unsure who to obey, their leader or the tide of the crowd. One, a man who had dragged Ilara earlier, lowered his eyes and took a step back. Another glanced at the people surrounding them and slowly unclenched his fists. The crowd surged forward, not violently, but intentionally, just enough to block the counselor's path. People shouted testimonies, naming wrongs, naming lies, naming fear. Ilara glanced at Roran. "They're helping us," she whispered. He nodded once, tight-lipped. "They're remembering themselves." And once they remember, tyranny loses its grip. The square had transformed. What had begun as a place of humiliation, a stage for fear and public spectacle, was now a ground for resistance. The balance had shifted. Edric Thorne, red-faced and trembling, took a backward step. The council's authority, once a suffocating blanket over the valley, was unraveling thread by thread, as the voices of those long silenced found the courage to speak. Ilara's heart surged with a mixture of relief, awe, and burgeoning hope. For the first time, she could see that the valley might survive this day not through compliance, but through courage. And for the first time in her life, she knew that the fight was no longer hers alone. The crowd had risen, and with it, a rebellion had quietly begun. The granary tunnels were dark and cold, but for the first time since dawn, Ilara felt the weight on her chest begin to ease. Roran guided her carefully along the uneven stone floor, the smell of damp earth and old grain filling the air. Each step echoed softly, a reminder that outside, the town square had erupted in chaos. Voices shouted, shouts of defiance blending with panic as the council tried to regain control, but Ilara didn't to look back. She didn't need to. "You've saved me," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Why?" Roran didn't answer immediately. His eyes were focused ahead, alert to every possible danger that might emerge from the tunnels. "Because no one should be punished for refusing to bend to tyranny," he said finally. "And because I cannot stand by while injustice reigns unchecked." She looked at him, noting the calm authority in his voice, the strength in his frame. It wasn't just physical power. It was a presence born of experience, survival, and a refusal to be intimidated. He had lived beyond the council's reach for years, and now, in this moment, he was extending that freedom to her. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To the mountains," he said simply. "It is the only place you will be truly safe from the council's reach for now." Ilara's mind raced. She had grown up in Hearthmoor, confined by its rules and rituals. The mountains had always been distant, mysterious, and forbidding. She had heard stories of exiles and hunters, but never thought she would belong there, or even see it as refuge. Now, however, it was the only path to survival. As they navigated the winding tunnels, Roran's hand remained lightly on her back, guiding her over slick stones and around unexpected drops. "The council will recover quickly," he warned. "They'll send search parties into the alleys, into the hills." "We need to move before dusk," Ilara nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words. She had always imagined leaving the valley as a quiet, gradual process, maybe marrying far away, maybe fleeing with someone she trusted. But nothing in her life had prepared her for this, a sudden violent rupture from everything she had known. Yet she felt no regret, only clarity. The council had shown its true face today. Cruelty masquerading as law, fear masquerading as order. And the people, her neighbors, her friends, the townsfolk who had begun to speak, had revealed another truth. Courage could exist even in the most oppressed hearts. They reached a small exit concealed among a tangle of roots and rocks. The evening sun slanted across the valley, streaking the mountains with gold and shadow. Roran paused, scanning the horizon. "We move at night. Daylight will draw attention." Ilara took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. She had never realized how suffocating Hearthmoor had felt until now, and how liberating it could be simply to step out into the open. Do you think the people will rise against the council?" she asked. Roran's expression was unreadable at first, then softened slightly. "Some already have," he said. "The courage you inspired and the truth I revealed has awakened others. Change takes time, but this is the beginning." Her heart lifted. For years, she had thought survival meant silence. Now she saw that survival might also mean resistance. She realized that the valley could be more than fear and control. It could be a place of justice, courage, and hope if people dared to act. Night fell over the mountains as they began their ascent, shadows stretching across the valley below. The town of Hearthmoor shrank behind them, a labyrinth of stone, fear, and memory. But each step forward was a reclamation of her life, a life no longer dictated by superstition or cruelty. Alara glanced at Roran. "Will we return?" she asked. He met her gaze, a faint, grim smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps. When the time comes, we will. But for now, we survive, and we plan. And when the council thinks they are safe, they will learn that fear is no longer enough." Together they disappeared into the shadows of the mountains. The rope that had bound her lay in the square behind them, a symbol of tyranny undone. The people who had once watched silently were no longer afraid to speak. Alara realized with a steady heartbeat that freedom like courage was contagious. And this was only the beginning.